Shabbat shalom, everyone. Wonderful to see all of you here. So as I mentioned earlier, I might not have been the best student at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. There was really only one class that I really was looking forward to, and that class was called homiletics, which means the art of public speaking or the art of sermon giving. And the professor that taught that class was Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who was the senior rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California. Now, the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles is home to a lot of Jews, and Valley Beth Shalom, or VBS as it is called, is an enormous congregation. And as far as rabbis go, I always loved listening to Rabbi Feinstein over others. Because not only was he great at just speaking and storytelling, he was exceedingly brilliant. It's one thing to be a good speaker, but Rabbi Feinstein could just walk in to the chapel with a chumash, no notes, and he could just pontificate pure brilliance for an hour, no sweat. Now, for someone like me, I could never do that in a million years. I was just so amazed by Feinstein. I kind of idolized him. He was my representation of God on earth. That's how good he was. Now, Feinstein, on the other hand, he did not know what to do with me at all. He had worked as a rabbi for a number of years up in Dallas, so he was one of the few rabbis in California that at least understood Texans, but he couldn't quite figure out why a kid from Bell County, Texas would want to become a Jew, much less a rabbi. So I booked a meeting with him to speak to him in his office, and the first time I walked into his office, he was sitting at his desk, and when I opened the door, it's like Godzilla had walked in. He just stared up at me, and he said, "I guess what they say is true, Jonathan. Everything is bigger in Texas." I loved Rabbi Feinstein, but sometimes he would get a little annoyed or irritated, and when that happened, all bets were off. So, for instance, he was a shorter guy, and sometimes we'd talk after class, and I would just be towering over him. And we'd be talking, and he'd say, "Jonathan, sit down because I don't want to look up at you while we're talking." So I would sit awkwardly in a chair. And one time, when I gave a practice sermon in his class, I made a big mistake. I made a boo-boo. I began my practice sermon with, quote, "So I was once," and when I said that, he stood up in the middle of class in front of all my colleagues and said, "Jonathan, I don't care how good of a speaker you are. If you ever begin a sermon with the word 'so,' I will throw my shoe at your head." And I kind of nodded. He was not done. He kept going. "I don't care where you're at. I will hunt you down and throw my shoe at you." And that, friends, is my beloved teacher, Rabbi Ed Feinstein. Genevieve and I used to attend his Torah study on Saturdays at VBS, but we didn't like the community itself. We loved him, but the community always seemed really aggressive and kind of cantankerous. Maybe they learned it from him, I don't know. One time, during the beginning of the Torah service, they took out the Torah scroll and started parading it around the Adonai Hagidon, the same thing that we just did not too long ago. And as they were parading it around this enormous sanctuary, people were taking out their tzitzit, kissing it like we do. But there was this little old lady, microscopic, at the very end of the aisle. And poor thing, she was trying to reach out to the Torah scroll and give it a kiss. But while she was attempting to do this, there was a really aggressive group of people behind her that were determined to kiss the scroll. And rather than wait patiently like normal adults, they began pushing each other like it was a mosh pit at a rock concert or something. And long story short, they knocked over this poor little old lady. Boom! Ah! It was horrible. By the way, I've been around the block in shuls before, And I hate to admit this, I've seen a number of Jews fall over. And I've noticed that when someone just plotzes on the floor, the initial Jewish reaction is to just freeze for about 6 seconds before attempting to help them. So when she fell, we all just stood around looking at this poor woman on the floor before somebody woke up and we helped her up. It was very, 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 very terrible. We helped her up. They finally get the Torah and they put it on the bima, but before they started to read from it, I looked at Feinstein and he's red, just fuming. And he goes up to the mic and he was obviously upset that they had knocked this poor woman over at his shul. And so he asks the congregation, how many of you just reached out to kiss the Torah? And everyone in the shul raised their hand. Then he asked, how many of you read Hebrew? Fewer hands went up. And they kept going. How many of you understand what you're reading in Hebrew? Very few hands go up at this point. And then he said, if you reach out to kiss the Torah and you can't understand Hebrew anyway, you're committing an act of idolatry. The room was dead silent. It was super awkward. I prayed he would stop talking. He did not. He said, what are you touching? A velvet cover, parchment and ink? That's not holy, he said, pointing to the scroll. What's holy is what the Torah says. We all sat there dumbfounded. He kept going. And he said something I'll never forget. I think about this often. He said, quote, kissing the Torah is like going into a restaurant and eating the menu instead. Okay. The sentiment in this week's Parshat, Tissa, is very similar. This Shabbat, we of course read about the story of the golden calf, which depicts the Israelites as making an idol while Moshe is still on the mountain. The text tells us that the Jewish people basically accost Aaron while his brother Moses is away. And Aaron solves the problem by encouraging them to remove their jewelry, melting it all down, and forming a statue of a cow. And then after they make it, there are two statements in the Torah that follow. And these statements are very, very different. And they're made by two different parties. The first statement is made by the people, and they've just made an idol. They say, quote, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Okay? Right after they say that, the Torah says that Aaron builds an altar in front of the idol that they just made, in front of the golden calf. And Aaron says, quote, tomorrow there will be a festival to Adonai. Now you see the difference between these two statements? Aaron is saying, this statue of the golden calf, this is not God. This is a symbol of God. This does not replace God. Friends, every time I see us parade the Torah around, I think about, of course, the statement that Rabbi Feinstein made with regard to the menu. But I also think about this same sentiment. The Torah is a symbol of God. It is certainly not a substitute for God. Now, please hear me when I say I don't think kissing the Torah without knowing Hebrew is idolatry. And I don't really think Feinstein really believed that either. I just think that in the moment he was so angry. And I know this because he came to class that next Monday, and he brought all of us in a circle, and he told us what had happened in his shul, because many of us, several other students, had seen it anyway. And he told us something, and it really left an impression on me. He said, Chevre, learn from my mistake. Never preach when you're angry. And when he said that, I remember thinking that I no longer idolized him the way that I had. Because in that moment, I had seen his humanity. And I realized that he was only a person, just like me, just like you, just like all of us, just a human being. Now here was someone who's incredibly learned, a talented speaker, and a truly brilliant rabbi, but it was my error for making him into my golden calf. You see, a rabbi can also be a symbol of God, but when you put him or her or anyone on a pedestal, or when you put anything besides God on a pedestal, that is problematic, because we should only show proper holy devotion to Hashem. Well, a couple months went by, and it was time for my ordination, and my graduating class had to select a classmate to present the senior sermon at ordination, and it was a pretty big deal to get selected, and I was very honored to be chosen as class speaker. And so I wrote my sermon. It was killer. Practiced it. The night before the ceremony, I got a call on my cell phone from Rabbi Feinstein. I picked up the phone. He didn't introduce himself at all. All he said was, "Jonathan, you're a good servant giver. I'll give you that. I'm very proud of you." And so I responded, "Thank you, Rabbi. He said, "No, I'm not done yet. He continued, "You're a good sermon giver, but if you start that speech tomorrow night with so, Jonathan, so help me, I will stand up from my seat in the front row and chuck my shoe at your head in front of God and everyone." So, in conclusion, friends, please know two things. Number one, only God is worthy of our attention. And two, everything really is bigger in Texas, even the shoes. Shabbat shalom.